So that's a bot. I thought someone named themselves a coder. It's not a bot. It's just my other laptop, which I'm going to screen record on. So I can't do it on Windows. There's no AI behind it. It's just he's running by itself.
Yeah, Kieran's artificial intelligence of his own. We don't know if he's real.
Or it could be the FBI. You never know.
We never know. All right then. Yeah, and again, Kieran, as you were saying, also, it's just if you're not talking, be on mute, prevent any background noise interference. And when you want to talk, just unmute. You can even, if you want to raise your hand and do other things like that. I might not see the screen because I have to do my slides, but you're welcome to just raise your hand, and Kieran will just point it out. So let's dive right into that. Okay, so today we're talking about, yes, the bright side of sharing data, some downsides as well. But, I think one of the things in recent times has been quite a lot of negative sentiment to data sharing in general, with the likes of Facebook and Google collecting a lot of data. And of course, you've seen this come up in the courts and all sorts of places, who's controlling them and all the other stuff. So people are getting somewhat, I'd say, unhappy about the circumstance with data, and rightfully so. But I kind of also want to point out that there are some really good points to sharing our data, and hopefully, as I go through this mini story, you'll kind of see what I mean. So we'll start it very simple. I think I just really want to start clearly that there's a big difference between personal and general data. I think when it comes to general data, most people don't actually really mind that we share data. This is in the example of researchers, they're sharing data all the time, but nobody really cares because they're using that to improve the boundaries of human knowledge. On the other hand, when it comes to personal data, a lot of people are a little bit more concerned. And it's kind of rightfully so, because when you really think about it, sharing data is kind of like telling a secret to your friend. And then that friend went and told everyone about it behind your back. It kind of sucks. And it's a little worse with places like Google, because they know the kind of secrets that you don't even tell your best friend. So it can seem, I'd say, a little scary at first, but there's actually quite a lot of benefits to sharing that data. And I think first to just highlight, the internet is kind of like this pile of trash. There's just so much of it, everywhere, and nobody really has the time to get through all of it by themselves. One example of this is YouTube is estimated to upload upwards of 500 hours of content every minute. That essentially means that in 2 days, they create enough content to last a lifetime. And a human being would not really be able to comprehend the sheer amount of data on the internet, let alone consume it. But somehow we're still able to find what interests us. And I guess the big question is how. And for that, I'd like to introduce Captain Algorithm. He's our everyday superhero. Captain Algorithm essentially helps us go through all of that trash and gives us that little bit of gold that we actually are interested in. So how does he do it? Well, simply put, algorithms are a set of instructions that help solve a problem. And the problem that developers are essentially trying to solve every day, at least on the internet, is how to give users what they want. Unfortunately, like money, algorithms don't grow on trees as much as we would like it to. They're created by people and engineers, and the building blocks for them, well, yeah, you guessed it, it's data. So when it comes to our personal usage on the internet, the most relevant data to help developers or people that build algorithms create useful algorithms would actually be your personal data. And the thing about algorithms is more equals better. So most algorithms these days are based upon the principles of machine learning, and more specifically, deep learning, I think is the most prevalent in the industry. Without boring everyone too much, I'd say machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence that tries to imitate the way humans learn. And deep learning especially eliminates the needs for humans to be part of that learning process. For algorithms to learn, much like a human being, they need lots of information. You can kind of think of it this way. We pump in tons and tons of data, the more the merrier. And this machine learning algorithm also known as Patrick Starr, will learn from it. There are a few more technicalities in between, but let's just call it a magic box that outputs a model that solves all of our problems. These models are then used to determine how we funnel data into every individual user, giving them the content that they desire without overwhelming them in the sea of information that's kind of building up the entire internet. So kind of jumping into 2020, the pandemic, I think more and more people's lives, well, everyone's lives were affected by this. But what that's meant is more people have turned to screens and, more importantly, the internet to solve a majority of their problems. This means more data than ever is being put online. So, what does that actually mean for yourself as an individual user? We're definitely getting studied a lot better. The algorithms are getting smarter. So the internet's going to become even more personalized than it's ever been, which it's not terrible. I'm not really complaining about that. But let's look at a more direct, real-world impacting case of data sharing. I think everyone in some way or other has come across contact tracing. It's one of the tools that's been used to deal with COVID-19. By sharing our data of where and when we've been to places, we're able to identify if we have come into contact with a COVID cluster. This allows us for quick and targeted measures to prevent the spread of the virus. The countries that have successfully implemented good contact tracing models actually prevented massive outbreaks and essentially avoided major lockdowns without overwhelming their healthcare infrastructure. You can look at countries like Korea, Taiwan. And contact tracing has only really been possible because we were willing to share our personal data, where we've been. Now, the lingering question that I imagine you all have is, after all that, this data has been collected, what next? I assume COVID will end, at least I hope it'll end. But the data collected by governments or institutes are going to outlive us. So what happens to all of that data? Governments have access to more personal movement data than ever before. Essentially, Big Brother is really watching over us. It would be very easy for governments to use some of that data, put it through a magic box again, and create a model to find out about each and every citizen, like where are we going, when are we going there, and potentially even the reasons for it. And that's a lot of information to give to Big Brother. And I'll let your imaginations kind of wonder at the possibilities of what they could do with that. But if you really think about it, that same data could also tell people where movement is actually happening. This could help build the right infrastructure and transportation networks to help reduce traffics and waiting times. It could also be used to optimize your city planning, even creating housing in the right places for the right people. And the list kind of goes on. So when it comes down to it, there's no real, data can be used for good and for bad. Even with the same data, you can use it in a multitude of ways. But when it really comes down to it, data collection and analytics are just tools. In the hands of the right person, it could bring unprecedented benefits to our society, or it could be the downfall of us all. I believe it's important to understand the value of our data and then work with these algorithm builders to maximize the potential of the data we have to offer with full transparency. That way, when we do share our data, we'd no longer be afraid. There are lots of movements coming about. One very big one that I know of is hashtag own your own data. And this is really empowering the users to understand a little bit more about what your data is and what its value, what value it can bring. And because of this, more and more companies are actually increasing their transparency and access to data on their platforms. If you look at a lot of especially in, you say, Europe, with GDPR compliances, you actually can specify what kind of data you're willing to share. You can even see where your data is being shared on Facebook and a few other places. And this gives each user a lot more control on where their data is going. And with some platforms even allowing you to specify what type of data you want to share. So it's kind of the right step in the direction of democratizing data. We even see some companies are offering solutions where you can make money off your own data. So be part of the whole ecosystem, right? Instead of them profiting entirely on your data, you can choose to sell your data to these companies to make money off of it, essentially being a shareholder in that data that's already online. So I don't really want to go too much into it. I kind of wanted to just introduce the topic a little bit and really just leave it to the floor, because there's a question that I just want to ask to everybody. How do you feel about personal data collection and what they're doing with all of that data? But that's it from me. Thanks you guys for listening. I hope it was not too long. And I just kind of want to let it to Kieran maybe to take over and start going on with the session.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Avi. No, I think you've nicely touched on a lot of areas in regards to data. And obviously the overlying thing here is that data is misused a lot, but it also has a lot of potential for good use. And moving forward, how do we sort of feel in regards to that? And I know there's a lot of us with differing backgrounds and understanding of what data is and what it's used for and our own perceptions of it. And that's all going to stimulate different opinions. And I can say from a nice, just to sum up what you said about the hashtag going forward, hashtag own your own data. Yeah, I do like the direction that the way that things are going. And this, we've had a lot of conversations. I know there's a lot of information out there about why data is bad. If you look at Facebook, what they did with Cambridge Analytica, there are a lot of documentaries about why sharing or how it can be misused. And yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's nice to start these convos of the good side of things. And maybe we can ask you, you've asked this question about you've given some outline about data, and maybe we can start the discussion by asking you, Avi, how do you feel about this data and the sharing of your data?
Well, thanks for asking. Well, I actually do have my own reservations about some of it. I think one that's definitely very, I guess, prevalent in Malaysia is the sharing of all of our data through MySejahtera. I believe that the centralization of all that data, with it being linked as well to our identity cards, is highly, I would say, it's kind of scary. So for me personally, I try my best to avoid using MySejahtera if I can. I do know that it does help, and like I will scan QR codes and put in the information just to give people access to if they want to contact trace me eventually. But because I do know the value of that, right? You do want to know if you are in a cluster and all that stuff. But it's definitely a very scary thought to give over all of your information to one place and have it all consolidated so nicely in the MySejahtera way. In a lot of other places, you can think Facebook and Google and that kind of stuff. I actually don't have too many reservations there. Honestly, my main concerns actually more on the transparency of the algorithms, not so much on giving the data, because I find that they can only really improve by getting the data. But the question is, when they do get the data, how do they use it to build models that serve me? Is it in my interest? Is it to manipulate me? Those are the questions that I am more interested in sort of looking, or at least finding out about through these sort of larger organizations. Does that answer the question?
Oh, yeah. No, yeah. Thanks for sharing. I think that's a really good point. How is the data being used? At the end of the day, that's important. And yeah, like Cambridge Analytica, for example, they used it horribly, right? They sort of, and this was really big a few years back, where they manipulated elections, even, manipulated politics in order to gain an advantage, which is very worrying. I completely agree there. And maybe to give an example of the other side of things, there's a platform called Generate. I don't know if you've heard of it. And what they're doing now is a sort of on your own data perspective. It's a browser basically. When you log on to your internet browser, it allows you to pick between two options. One option, you either keep your data private, keep your information private, and it obviously puts all the settings in place to not share your data. Or you have the second option where you can sell your data. You can generate value from your data. So by browsing, essentially, you can make money. And one of their selling points is sort of like you mentioned as well, where you want to filter through all of the ads. Because if I go on YouTube and they give me ads, sometimes I'm thinking, wait a minute, these ads aren't relevant at all. And I'm wondering in my head, how the hell did they figure out that I am interested in this thing and that thing and that thing? And I'm like, well, it's not relevant. I'm not interested in buying a toy car for a kid. And maybe they picked it up because I Googled one day, my brother has a little kid, I Googled one day the present for my nephew. And so they picked up, here, they're going to start showing me these ads. And that may not be something necessarily I want to see. And what this company does is it allows you to create your own profile. And so you can sort of navigate through ads and information in a particular profile. You can say, okay, this is what I want to look at. I want to look at more algorithm-oriented things. I want to look at more research-oriented things, etc. And that's maybe on the other side, something that's positive that's happening. I don't know what other people think about these things. If I can open up the question to the floor. What are your thoughts on data and your perspective on data sharing?
Yeah, let's give everyone a moment.
So I think Alvin has raised his hand.
Sorry to be the first one, I guess.
Thank you.
So I think when it comes to the whole data sharing thing, it's very easy to. I think I'm not alone in saying that the whole thing with Cambridge Analytica makes it very easy to be cynical with people who take data. And yes, there is the option to monetize data, but for the amounts of, let's say, personal privacy that you have to sacrifice in order to get quote unquote personalized suggestions or personalized ads and so on, these companies are ultimately, the ultimate goal is to make money off you, to get you to buy stuff. And that's why, honestly, there's like a little flush of triumph when when I get a YouTube advert and it's something completely unrelated to what I would usually go for, because it's like, aha, they don't have a handle on it. And I guess well, when it comes to the internet, a lot of people like their anonymity, and that is almost like a indicator, a marker saying, yes, we haven't quite got the hang of what you are into, and therefore you are very difficult to sell to. I don't know, just my 2 cents, just chucking out the whole personality and preference thing out there.
Well, actually, just before we, personality and preference stuff, just quick sort of look back at the Cambridge Analytica stuff. I think it was probably the reason actually I thought about this initially, because when we framed that story, Cambridge Analytica were the demons for using, letting Donald Trump spend all of this money to, save an election, to really, steal an election, sorry, not save election. But when you look at it in totality, in that specific election, Hillary Clinton actually spent $1.4 billion in total compared to Trump's $957.6 billion. This is the actual number, just quoting it. And if you wanted to say that Donald Trump paid to win an election, you'd say he just paid very efficiently to win an election. So what really happened was Donald Trump actually focused on Facebook ads and online ads in particular, because he had actually got funding a lot later than Hillary Clinton. Therefore, he had missed out on a major opportunity to actually invest in the television side, which was a much higher cost. So essentially what he did well was targeted advertising through the internet, versus what Hillary Clinton did, which was very broad scale. So this idea of spending money to get attention is not new. I just think what's happened with Cambridge Analytica is they did it so well that people got a little upset. And I don't blame them for it, because it does suck to feel like you're manipulated. But this has been around for a long time. It's not a new problem, and this is really, I think, more of a political question versus a data sharing problem. Just want to put that in there.
So, I mean, the central theme here is that sort of capitalism, how we're going to get the most utility from the least money spent. And I like what Alvin said. Sometimes I also try to put in, like, you want to try and trick the algorithm. You want it so that they don't understand who you are and give that tailored ad. But the differentiator between, at least how I feel, the differentiator between Facebook and what Cambridge Analytica did and what you'd probably get on, just casual TV ads, advertising, is that, yes, the TV has a profile of who you are and what you watch, right? But they aren't capable of learning more, and not because they haven't tried. Obviously, we live in a capitalistic world. I'm sure if they had the power to, they would learn all of this about you. But the sheer amount of data that Facebook collects about us, and personalized data, they collect sort of what things you click on, how long you spend scrolling in a day, for example, which groups you spend most of your time in, which people whose posts you like and interact with the most. They track all of this information, and that's a lot of personal information. Versus you look at a TV and sort of TV adverts, it's in the background there, and I know this because I've interned in a satellite TV company once before, but they can't really. The problem that they face is, okay, who's watching the TV at the time? You have one TV subscription, but you've got a household family, 5 different people, and suddenly that TV may be running, but you don't know who's watching it. You don't know how long they spend on it. You don't know their age. You don't know specific details about them. And there's a lot of hidden variables, so to speak. And one interesting thing is that I think it wasn't such a big problem beforehand because we never had that ability to manipulate people's opinions. I'm sorry, I'm just seeing what Farrell's doing, which is a bit weird. You couldn't manipulate people's thoughts and beliefs and opinions, you didn't have that power to, but now we're moving to this day and age, and, Trump maybe didn't really actively think that this was what he was trying to achieve. He may have just been like, okay, I'm late to the game. I want to put in as much money and get as much utility as I possibly can. And so maybe the problem is that we just aren't ready for the sheer amount of information that we have available now. But I'm still curious to think about what everyone's perspective is in terms of data. And I'm not sure how do you raise your hand in this platform? Does anybody know?
There seems to be like a little smiley at the bottom of the screen, and that comes up with a bunch of emotes.
Well,
That's how it works.
Okay, yeah, I was also a bit unaware of that. Yeah, cool. I don't know if everyone's testing out or if people are actually raising their hands now. But I think I see Louise's hand is up. Do you have thoughts on this, Louise?
Yes. Being from a legal background, I'm always thinking through that angle, and so I'm always wondering, like, how do you set up rules so people can be preserved and safe with the use of their data. I was wondering how, in a global situation as
Sorry, I think
the internet is, how do you do to create some rules? Because what we heard from Avi earlier was the fact that using data can be really useful. And
Hi, Avi, I think you muted.
Yeah, so I think the question was, before she kind of got cut off, was that it's how do you govern this, with all this information out there and data. And right now, one of the things that you see as a major loophole is, if people will say their data stored in this country, and so this country's rules don't apply to it, and all these other things. I think the only one that really has a sort of even a somewhat complete system is GDPR with their standards. But even with that, it's very difficult because they've sort of enforced or said in their thing. How do you enforce this? Where they say that if you have any European user on your platform, you have to comply by GDPR. But if I'm running a platform in Malaysia, will I be compliant? And if I get somebody from, let's say, I don't know, France on it, how do I have to change my platform? How do I run? Because the laws in Malaysia, of course, don't specify something. We have a different PDPA law, and it's different standards. So what do we follow in those? So it's a very complex, I'd say, I guess, setup when you go global. And maybe we can go down. Anybody interested in sharing what their thoughts are on that setup?
Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in or raise your hand, whichever.
All right, I'll go.
Nice.
I mean, from what you guys were talking about, I mean, I think as a layman or a consumer, your everyday consumer, average Joe who doesn't really know much about data, maybe sees a couple of things here and there in the news, but I think so this is like I'm going to try and frame the questions because I've got a two-part, and I think one is partially answered, but I wanted some more clarity on it because, Avi, I think you talked about, the issue is about transparency of the algorithms, right, as opposed to other factors. So, the question is how does one actually go about that? And I think the second part, which ties to that question, is, I think, I read your article. I kind of just didn't not quite skim through it, but I looked through it, and I think the problem is, or at least what comes to me or what occurs to me, is that when it comes to data and things being used, whether it's manipulated or not, I think the issue is, like you said, data is, at the end of the day, it's a tool. Who's using it? And I think for someone like me or your average Joe, when you look at who kind of, not to say runs it, but manages it, you're looking at governments, you're looking at monopolies. And, depending on what you know about your sort of government, because you talked about Malaysia, not the most trustworthy government in the world. And, the history of monopolies typically has not really boded well for any one outside of that, if you know what I mean. So, these are just my sentiments, but I want to go back to refining or probing deeper into that question. Is, you talked about transparent algorithms. How do you actually go about that? What is something that's out there? Because I don't know this kind of stuff.
That's a really good question, actually. So I didn't touch into it too much, but I did talk about the magic box that helps create models.
Right.
And this is
oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so it's a very difficult to solve problem in a lot of cases, because especially in deep learning, and again, there's a lot of data scientists here that probably also have opinions on this, but deep learning specifically does not allow for human interpretation, at least easily. It's a struggle to interpret what they do. When we pump in all of that data, there's a concept of, you have a neural network, that's your magic box in a lot of ways, and it takes in all of this data. And through a learning process, which again, I don't want to dive into too much detail about, it sort of uses all the information to build up its understanding of how it should decide stuff. And the thing is, because we use a lot of these deep learning techniques in industry, it's based on models that sometimes the people that pump in the data don't even really understand. They just throw in all the data and they just get a good output, and it's very good at giving you output, but no one can interpret why. And you see a lot of use cases where this is problematic. And I think there are a few historic stories, like I think one was in UK where they did the grading of all of the, exam students that were doing, I think it's GCSEs. And they had this major issue where for schools that were coming from less elite neighborhoods, they were actually downgrading them. And then if you were from an elite neighborhood, they would upgrade your
Right.
mark. And so you could see that what they had learned from this is people that are coming from elite backgrounds, elite schools, should have higher grades. but that's not necessarily the case. It's just potentially because historically the ones that would have gone to those schools could afford to, had parents that gave them proper educations, or spend extra on their education and all those other factors that came into play. But machines don't quite understand that. So that's the one kind that's, I'd say, very difficult, but there are techniques coming about to help interpret them better, these models. And there is improvement and movement in that space. But again, I'll let someone tackle that that's more into the field. The other one is when you don't dive completely into deep learning, where you have this more assisted learning. And this is where the people that actually write the programs work with subject matter experts to understand maybe the problem they're trying to solve. And then they write algorithms that are very catered or tailored to that use case. So it's not as easy to do. And some of them even not as accurate as you would say with some of these deep learning machine models. But what then you can sort of understand is how that works. And these are the ones that probably are a good starting point for conversations into, if you run these kind of algorithms, maybe you can share what are the thought processes. Maybe there are white papers that they can write about, okay, this is the way we structured it. This is the experts that we spoke to. And from that, you can get more of an understanding. But that's just one look at it. Again, I'd sort of let the machine learning experts take over from that. Anybody want to chime in? I know there's a few.
Okay. Processing.
Maybe I can just add to that before. I know there's some professionals here in that area, that field, but my 2 cents on that, and I think it's best explained with an example as well. So there was this machine learning algorithm which learned how to classify the risk of people. So after people were incarcerated, when they were put in front of a judge, they give this, it's called recidivism rating, where it's the risk of them having a repeat offense. And this is something that judges normally do. And the US, I think they came up, a private company came up with a model which did this. And they basically fed in historical data into that model, and it spat out sort of this, it developed, it trained and learned this algorithm, right? And so now when new people came forward and they basically just put in their information, put in what they'd done, and it sort of classified, okay, the risk of this person having a repeat offense is this high or this much. And it was actually used in practice, and it took a few, after being used in practice and after seeing the results, they realized that in fact what had happened was because of societal bias, because of bias in society of placing higher risk on Black people to be more risk of a reoffense in the past. Historically, that was the bias in the societal bias, basically. That meant that the algorithm learned this and was now having these repeated offenses, and basically people who were in the exact same situation, they did a complete analysis on it and saw that white people who were incarcerated or who were put in front of a judge for a particular reason, they were given less risky results from the algorithm, even though they ended up, let me restart. So they were given low risk sort of results from the algorithm, but they ended up being reoffending very near in the future. And then the same people, so the same results that came out for Black people who got higher risk ratings, far fewer tended to actually repeat offense. And so there was this huge bias in the algorithm itself, and people had to do analysis on the results of the algorithm in order to understand it, which was a very it's a very after the matter. Only once you've actually started using it in practice can you understand sort of the bias of it better. And that was something that has been studied a lot more recently, and I gotta go in a second, but that's something that's been studied a lot more recently. And I saw very recently how people can isolate the bias, and so there are techniques now. I don't know the details of them. I was looking at a white paper as well, but they have techniques which can isolate, here is the bias, and we know that this is something that is biased. Let's remove the bias associated with it. Right now, there are a lot of superficial ways to do this, and the best example is this idea, it's natural language processing, where you have words like king, which are definitely always associated with male, right? And they have this way of finding associations between words. But then when you move to stuff like, nurse, it associates it with female. If you move to things like, and you start going down to jobs as well, it associates it to male because of this historical bias, but it's no longer true. And now they have superficial ways of removing that association, which is steps in the right direction, I think. But at the moment, it's at least from my understanding, it's still fairly superficial. And getting to a level where we have very transparent algorithms and algorithms that don't have this bias requires a huge understanding of the data, of the models, and a lot of other things that we don't currently have. And that's my 2 cents on the matter. If there's somebody who wants to chime in.
Honestly, I'd actually love to hear an expert's take on this, because I think trying to get unbiased data in the first place is already massively difficult.
Yeah, it's massively difficult, 100%. The question is, how do you remove the bias from data? Or how do you collect unbiased data, right?
I mean, I would say humans are complicated beings to begin with. Like we've got a lot of aspects to us, whether it's race, culture, gender. Well, a million times more than whatever I've said. So it's kind of hard to just compress it all down into a computer algorithm. But I think with advancing technology, it could get closer and closer. It may never be perfect, but we might get closer and closer to that point. So maybe with enough technological advancement, there might be less bias in the data collection.
So that's an interesting point, but I also want to raise a lot of the techniques that are being used in machine learning, especially in industry right now, are very outdated. The deep learning concepts that use a lot of data to go in, the only reasons they've been popularized in the modern times is because processing powers of computers have increased tremendously. So one part is we don't have a lot of incentive for industries to move in that direction, because as I mentioned before, these models that they do output from churning in tons of data are very good. Even if you don't understand them, they are very good at probably increasing their profitabilities or something that they're trying to achieve. So with very little incentive for them to go search for these technologies, because if there was, you would see at this point we'd probably not be using technologies that probably was first coined. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was the 50s, right?
Yeah, 50s. I mean, the very first neural, there was work already, very significant work on neural networks and proving theoretical results in deep neural networks already in the 90s as well. And this was already looking at deep neural networks.
You mean the 1890s?
No, the 1990s.
1990s. Okay.
Yeah, somebody else can probably chime in for when the first neural network was designed. It was just a very simple one-layer neural network. I don't remember the exact date. No, but yeah, on that point, and maybe take it back away from specifics in terms of a more philosophical perspective of it, is this idea where we want to know more and more data, and the reason why we want to know more and more data, because and there's this theory, Laplace puts this theory forward, where if you knew the sort of behavior of every single atom in the universe at a particular given instance, you knew its how the mechanics of it, you'd be able to predict everything that has happened in the past and everything that's going to happen in the future, as if you knew every single bit of information at that given time. And I think that's the sort of general approach for machine learning, data-oriented machine learning, where you've got information. You can never get to that infinite amount of information at a given point, but the goal is to sort of make better predictions with this idea in mind that the more data you have, the more accurate predictions you can get. And with less data, we have to think of smart ways to do this. And deep learning and neural networks have focus perhaps in certain fields. They do focus on doing smart things to improve that without using more data, but it falls under this data-oriented machine learning. So simple sometimes is better, and there's also another theory where the simpler is better. It's like if you're let's say in a social situation, you can come up with the most complex reasoning why somebody does something, but at the end of the day, you know what, the simple reason is probably the better reason. And that's the case sometimes with machine learning models, where if you have just this very simple algorithm, you could achieve anything that theoretically you could achieve anything you wanted with 100% accuracy if you had all the information available and if you had an unlimited compute power, obviously, which is all unrealistic expectations.
I think that's all cool, very technical and the philosophical and research side, but actually wouldn't mind asking maybe some of my ex-Maxis colleagues that are here, what are sort of Maxis' approaches to data on this kind of level and the transparency and how they use their algorithms, because I know there are quite a few in there. Sorry to single you guys out.
Well, maybe can chime in here a bit. Probably won't be talking about Maxis because we haven't really been doing too much on the data side from that side of things. We tend to not share too much of the data out to outside people, but I mean, for my current role here in Plus Energy, what we're doing with data is to to get electricity data from the various businesses out there and try and see how we can use it to improve their efficiency when they come to using electricity. Basically, help them to reduce electricity costs while still doing the same amount of work that they used to do, or even more, right? And I think if when it comes to sharing data, this would be something very useful because as a small company, right, the data we get is very limited. We can only use within, let's say, for example, the few hundred companies that we have to try and give them, recommendations and the likes. Whereas if comparatively, TNB would have allowed sharing of electric data from all the different industries out there, it would serve as very good benchmark to the industry players out there saying that, oh look, I'm running let's say a glove factory, right? This is what comparable people are using versus me, and then from there, hopefully, maybe they can find ways, things, take inspiration that actually more efficient ways to use electricity and the likes. So, and I think that's one of the good things if we do adopt a data sharing kind of economy kind of thing. Though I think the hard part between that is that if I'm a company that's using it very, very efficiently, I wouldn't want my competitors to know, right? Because I can undercut the prices, I can overtake them and then become the market leader just by being more efficient than them. A net loss for the whole society, but a net gain for the particular company itself.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think this comes back a bit to what Louise was asking. At the end, this governance needs to be in place, and what kind of laws moving forward will allow us to at least democratize this data that probably is being held up by very few monopolies, which is not great. TNB is definitely one of that has all the access to this data, and if they did share it, you're talking about ability to reduce even the entire Malaysia's carbon footprint if they were willing to just to share that last bit of to share that kind of information. But again, sorry, Sheng, you're going to say?
Oh yeah, no, I mean yeah, but obviously TNB has their own vested interest to not share the data because that will just impact their profits at the end of the day. So yeah, be interesting to see how can people overcome the idea that if I share my data, I might take some short-term losses, but as a whole, it will be better for everybody.
Yeah, it's a really tough question, and at the end of the day, everyone, when put into circumstances where they have no information on the others, again, prisoner's dilemma, right? When you don't know anything about everyone around, you're going to act in your own best interest, even if that screws up everybody in the long run. So I think the point that we kind of have to sort of eventually dive into and think about is how do we set up governance on a much larger scale, but it kind of potentially goes to the same problem. That means we have one overarching monopoly that governs everything, or how do we find a way to democratize even the governance of the data, because you wouldn't want one person to be in control of that entirely, or one organization, right?
because they'll come back to a lot of the same problems.
I think personally it's all right to have one particular organization sort of in charge of the data, so to say, right? I mean, even before the digital world, that's what a lot of government agencies, a lot of people are doing, which is collecting data, and it has helped quite a fair bit. It's more of, at the end of the day, what's the check and balances behind it, so that we can safely give our data and trust that there are check and balances to prevent misuse of the data, rather than just saying, yeah, I don't think we should put it in a single database or a single organization having it all, because otherwise what you would have is basically, like today, you just have a bunch of silos, especially if we look at the Malaysian government. None of the ministries, or even within the ministries, they're not talking to themselves, right? There's a lot of things you could have done that would have made things a lot better, but yeah.
Very good point. Kieran, you want to go?
No, yeah, I was gonna say, that's a very good point. As I was saying, I was thinking on the lines of this idea of nobody wants to. The idea of transparency, right? It's not to your best interest to be transparent about your algorithms, no matter how simple or complicated they are, because you're basically telling your competitors, hey, here's what I'm doing. You can achieve this as well. And one thing that sort of I made a correlation with as well is this open AI. It's they basically supposedly they try and develop open source AI models essentially, and something interesting that happened very recently, and I don't know what the reasons behind this was. They developed this natural language processing framework, GPT, which was meant to be open access. GPT-1 was open access, GPT-2 was open access, but then GPT-3 onwards, or GPT-3 now currently, was not open access anymore. And the reasonings why they gave this, and also previous versions of their model, this is not even considering data, right? It's just only looking at the model itself, where they produced this AI model essentially. They didn't release the very, very powerful AI models because on one, maybe they're thinking about their competitors here, but it's all open source, so they technically don't really mind. So if you remove that aspect even, the reason why they didn't share that was because it's so powerful. And what this model could do was generate text. It could generate paragraphs. It could generate articles on the fly automatically. And the worry was that now you have models which are so powerful. One, yes, companies can take it and start using it for their own gain, which, depending on the values of the company, that's good. Individuals can do that. I mean, there's a lot of deep fake out there that we've seen recently, which is really bad, and that's badly abused. And with all of these reasons is the morality of it. If you put something, it's a tool at the end of the day. Maybe to sort of my perspective on this is like algorithms, and it's a tool at the end of the day. And where does the morality lie? Does it lie with these companies who have their ways of using that tool, or does it lie with the people who come up with the algorithm? Is that something that, as developers, me personally as developers, should I be thinking about what are the bad use cases of my thing that I'm coming up with, or should I be the one who pushes that to the companies, in their own interest?
And I think one very quantifiable example that most people can imagine is self-driving cars. And in a lot of ways, when it comes to morality, is imagine a self-driving car has to decide between, it's running straight in direction, it's potentially going to kill someone, and it can choose to swerve to the left and it could kill somebody else. And so how do you value the decision-making process there? Who is the moral decision maker decide someone else's life is more valued than others? So, these are the things that become very difficult questions from a philosophical level. And it's easier to just, in Malaysia, to say, tai chi the responsibility to somebody else. So, good point to be raised. Just keeping track of mindful of time. We already kind of run out of the time. So, I think we just want to wrap up. If we have any last statements from anybody quickly before we sort of just open up to just chilling, and whoever wants to go can go off. And whoever wants to stay can stay.
At the risk of sounding like a bad movie cliche, I think humans are like the biggest thing getting in the way of machine learning and progression. Because at the end of the day, in order to have a good model, in order for a model to thrive, you need to have both access to, how should I put it, a good training framework. I think that's what they call it. I mean, if any of the data scientists can chip in. But you need to have access to the models which are powerful enough to train themselves into accuracy. But in order to train themselves into accuracy, you also require the data sets to train them, essentially. And that's the point which came into mind when your ex-colleague, I don't know if is he still your colleague? Sheng. But this is the main thing that came to mind because you are essentially competing for data, not just for data, but also for being able to access that data, and then that sort of nicely comes back to the theme of the of the talk. I don't know whether it's possible to have the data publicly available just all the time, or legislate people so that they have to give up all data into the public domain. I don't think it's possible because you would need a company to do it. Otherwise, there's no financial incentive. But I don't know. I'm just speaking purely from an idealistic standpoint. Just put all the data out there, treat it like research. Everyone's trying to learn from each other. But no, I don't. Like that's far too idealistic.
Well, we need idealistic people to push these things along. It's not the realists that are going to move society. On that note, I think it's a really nice ending point. Really glad everyone could join, at least for this more official part of it. And this is something that Kieran and I have been very excited to do. Just, again, it's also leaning on that topic, sharing ideas is part of sharing data. We want to share as much of these ideas with as many people, have more discussions, open it up so that more people have access to these kind of conversations. Because one major thing we realize is a lot of these conversations are actually happening regularly, but they tend to be in the sort of academic world. And that sort of is a very close-knit group. So very few people outside of, or if you're in a company as well, that's another place it happens a lot as well. But if you're not in access to a big corporate or the sort of academic institutes, you don't really get a chance to sort of be part of these things. And I really wanted to sort of give that back to the community as a whole. So we're really looking at how we can do this. And we'll do it, of course, in small groups. And we don't want to bring too many people because it's really hard to discuss as you get very large. Because we don't want it to be a sort of seminar, just a sit and present. We want it to always be a conversation. But we'll try to see if we can have more panels and other stuff in the long run. But the idea is to just have this all done, then record it, and then we're going to share it so that more people can be part of the wider conversation. Maybe we can even have like smaller breakout follow-up sessions if people are interested. But it's just this is the sort of mindset that we have moving forward with this. And I'd just like to thank everyone for their time. So really thanks for coming. And anybody, and Kieran, do you have any last words as the moderator? All right, I guess not. Well, on that note, then everybody, you're welcome to do as you please. For those that want to stay, you can stay as well. I think Kieran and I are going to be here for a while just chatting, talking about different ideas. And you're also welcome to go and converse with anyone in small private sections. I'm just going to step up for a moment, guys. Thanks for your time.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you very much,
Cheers, guys. Thank you, everyone, for just sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Hey, Jesse Sheng, you wanna come to the private room for a bit?
I'm kind of already following Jesse.
Farrell, you seem to be unable to sit still.
Private.
Iran.
Oi, 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 oi.
I think he's away from his keyboard at the moment. Don't know what's happening.
I think so. So how does this thing work? How do you have a room?
My understanding of it is that it's a virtual office.
No, I know, but where's the boundary is what I'm asking.
The boundary? What do you mean the boundary?
Boundary for each private rooms.
I believe it's like based on the walls. Right? You can see there's like a floor change between the main office, isn't it?
I think there's, I forgot how exactly, but I think there is a way you can have private conversations with people. Oh, and there are also private zones.